Chapter 5. Oliver's life changes. Oliver was taken to the nearest police station. The officer at the gate looked at the boy and said, "Another young thief?" He turned to the old man, Mr. Brownlow, and asked, "Are you the person who was robbed, sir?" Mr. Brownlow said that yes, he was, but he was not sure that Oliver was the boy who actually took the handkerchief. He didn't really want Oliver to be taken to court. As the Artful Dodger and Charlie Bates saw that Oliver was arrested, they started to run away. Back to the police station, when Mr. Brownlow said that he didn't want Oliver to be taken to court, the policeman said, or the officer at the police station said that it was too late and he must go in front of or before the magistrate then. Oliver then was locked in a small stone cell. It was really disgusting, dirty and smelly. And as the key was turned in the lock, Mr. Brownlow thought and said to himself that there was something in Oliver's face that made him feel that he could be innocent. He also wondered where he had seen someone like Oliver before. But after a while he said that it could be, or it must be, his imagination. Some time later, Oliver was taken to court. The magistrate was there. A magistrate is a judge who dealt with small crimes in local courts, and the magistrate in that area or district was well known as a disagreeable and bad-tempered man. He was called Mr. Fang. That day, Mr. Fang was in a particularly bad mood. He frowned angrily at Mr. Brownlow, the old gentleman, and asked him sharply who he was. Mr. Brownlow told him his name, and as he was talking, Mr. Fang interrupted him and talked to the officer, asking him what Mr. Brownlow's charge was or what he was charged with. Just then the officer said that he was not charged and that he was accusing the boy who was Oliver Twist. Mr. Fang asked Mr. Brownlow about what happened. And the moment Mr. Brownlow started to talk, Mr. Fang shouted at him, asking him to keep quiet, and then he spoke to the policeman, asking him about what happened as he arrested the boy. The policeman said everything that he heard, but said that when he had searched Oliver, he found nothing with him. Mr. Fang asked if there were any witnesses, but the policeman said that there were no witnesses. Mr. Brownlow started to tell Mr. Fang what happened after the magistrate asked him to speak. And then Mr. Brownlow said that Oliver had been hurt already, and he was afraid that he was ill. Mr. Fang, the magistrate, said that he didn't believe for a moment that Oliver was ill. He looked at Oliver, who was in a horrible condition, and said, "Come on now, don't try any clever tricks with me." And then he asked Oliver about his name. Oliver was deadly pale. He was weak. He was too weak to speak. He felt the room was spinning round him. And at last he managed to whisper a request for water, but the magistrate refused angrily. Suddenly, Oliver fainted and fell to the floor. Mr. Fang stared at Oliver angrily and said, "Guilty." He sentenced Oliver 3 months prison. Then he asked the policeman to let Oliver lie where he was on the floor, saying that he would soon be tired of that. He thought that Oliver was pretending, and announced that the court was then closed. Just then, a man in an old black coat rushed in, shouting, "Stop!" He asked them not to take the boy away. He said that he had seen it all, and he said that he was the bookshop owner. Mr. Fang's face was very black with anger at this unexpected interruption, but the bookshop owner demanded to be heard. He said that he had seen two boys steal the handkerchief and then they ran away, leaving Oliver to be arrested. Mr. Fang, in a final burst of bad temper and anger, said that his time had been wasted and announced that Oliver was innocent, ordering that everybody should be out of court. Mr. Brownlow was leaving and going down the street when he saw Oliver lying on the pavement, shaking, and his face was as white as death. Mr. Brownlow said, "Poor boy, poor boy." And then he called a coach and drove Oliver away to his house in the north of London. In Mr. Brownlow's house, Oliver was taken good care of. He received more care and kindness than he had ever had in his life. But he had a fever, and for many days he lay there unconscious. When he finally awoke, weak, thin, and pale, he looked anxiously around the room and asked himself what room it was. He also wondered where he was. He said to himself that this was not the place where he slept in, or where he fell asleep in. In other words, where he fainted. Mrs. Bedouin, who was Mr. Brownlow's motherly old housekeeper, heard Oliver talking to himself. She asked him to be quiet, and she told him that if he didn't obey her, he would be ill again. She asked him to lie down. Oliver saw a picture of a woman on the wall. He looked at the picture closely, and he then asked Mrs. Bedouin if she knew who the woman in the picture was. But Mrs. Bedouin said that she didn't know who the woman was. She asked Oliver if he liked the picture. Oliver said that the eyes looked so sad, and they seemed to be staring at him. He also added that it seemed as if the person was alive and wanted to talk to him but couldn't. Mrs. Bedouin told him that he was weak and nervous after his illness, and she asked him not to worry about things like that. Later that day, Mr. Brownlow came to make sure that Later that day, Mr. Brownlow came to make sure that Oliver was okay. He was delighted to see that Oliver could sit up. But then Mr. Brownlow stared hard at Oliver. Oliver talked to Mr. Brownlow and said that he hoped Mr. Brownlow was not angry with him. Mr. Brownlow said that he was not angry with Oliver at all. But then he spoke to Mrs. Bedouin and said, "Look, Mrs. Bedouin, look there." Mr. Brownlow pointed to the picture of the woman above Oliver's head on the wall. He was talking about the similarity between the faces of Oliver's face and the face in the picture or in the painting. Mr. Brownlow said that it was a living copy of the picture. Oliver's face, of course, was a living copy of the picture. He said that even the expression on both the faces was the same. Oliver didn't understand what Mr. Brownlow was talking about, but he was alarmed by Mr. Brownlow's excitement about the similarity. Meanwhile, the Dodger and Charlie Bates were on their way back to Fagin's house. Charlie Bates rolled on the ground and laughed and laughed. He just said, "When I saw Oliver running away so fast, round all the corners, bumping into walls, and all this time I had the handkerchief in my pocket," and he kept laughing at Oliver, who was innocent and was arrested for the crime that they had committed. Just then, the artful Dodger told him, "And what about Fagin?" He wondered what Fagin would say. And then when they returned back to Fagin, Fagin asked them about where Oliver was. They looked at each other and they didn't answer him. Fagin took hold of the Dodger's collar and shook him violently and said, "Tell me or I will kill you." The Dodger managed to slip out of his coat, and then he told him that the police had got Oliver. There was a fight between Fagin and the boys, in which Fagin held a metal pot and threw it at the artful Dodger, who missed it, and it hit Charlie Bates. The fight was silenced and interrupted by the entrance of Bill Sykes. Bill Sykes, a big man of about 35, in a black coat and very dirty trousers, with a brown hat on his head and a dirty handkerchief around his neck. He also had a 3-day-old beard. A white dog with torn ears followed them into the room. He kicked the dog into a corner and looked round at the signs of the battle, saying, "What the devil is going on here?" Sykes asked Fagin, "Are they trying to murder you, Fagin?" Then he said, "I would do if I was them. I would have done it long ago." Sykes asked Fagin to give him some beer and not to poison it. He said it in the form of a joke, but if anybody noticed the evil look on Fagin's face, he would really understand the hatred in his heart towards Sykes. Just then, Fagin said that Oliver had been caught by the police. He also said that he was afraid that the boy might say something which would get them all into trouble. Sykes said that it was very likely, and that Fagin had got problems. Just then Fagin commented saying that if they were in trouble, then a lot of other people would be in trouble too. He meant that Sykes would be in trouble too. Sykes said that somebody must find out what's happened. If he hasn't, and if he hadn't said anything yet, they must catch him when he leaves the police station. Nobody dared to go near the police station. But the problem was solved with the arrival of two young ladies who Oliver had met one evening in Fagin's house. Fagin spoke to one of them, who was called Nancy, and he asked her if she could go to find out what had happened to Oliver. Nancy said no, and said that she wouldn't do so. But Sykes said that Nancy was the only one there that the police in that district didn't know. He told Fagin that she would go. Nancy refused once again. Just then Bill Sykes said she will go, Fagin, and with a mixture of threats and promises, he soon persuaded Nancy to go. Nancy set off at once at the police station, pretending to be a shy, frightened girl who was Oliver's sister, and she asked if her poor little brother was there. But the police officer told her that he was not there and the gentleman had got him. Nancy asked about the old gentleman and who he was. The policeman told her that Oliver had become very ill and Mr. Brownlow, the old gentleman, had taken him to his house in the Prep.1 district of North London. Nancy returned back to Fagin with the news about Oliver. And just then, Fagin said that they must find Oliver. He told everybody that no one can stay there because it was too dangerous then. He asked them all to walk around Pentonville and keep their ears and eyes open. He asked them not to come back until they had some news of Oliver, and if they could kidnap him, he asked them to do so. He said that they had got to keep him quiet before he started talking about them to his new friends. After telling everybody to go out, he pushed everybody out of the room and double-locked the door behind him. Then he took out his hidden box and very carefully hid all the watches and the jewelry beneath his clothes. Hope you understood the events. Here are some questions and answers for practice.